evil thing I've ever heard. Jack was walking through the building, and it definitely was not what he was expecting, like at all. I mean, what do you expect when you hear the Dozier School for Boys? Maybe you're thinking rows and rows of desks, maybe a campus with other activities, sports, a big cafeteria. It had all of those things, it did. None of them were well kept, but there was more. Past all of that, there was where the areas where the boys would sleep and would spend most of their time, where they were kept. I mean, it's supposed to be a place to help children, right? But instead, Jack said it looked like a prison. The whole place felt grimy and dark and depressing. Like right when you walk in, there's this suffocating feeling, and you can't even quite put your finger on it. It seemed like body odor was the smell. Maybe that's what was so suffocating. It was heavy, it lingered long after you left. And why on earth does this place, this school for boys, smell so strongly of urine? Jack didn't have to wonder long. He would get those answers immediately. Being a teacher of delinquent kids at a short-term residential center in, I believe Tallahassee, Florida, Jack found it really hard to keep walking because it genuinely looked like a prison for boys. He asked one of the guards. Yeah, there's guards in this place. Jack asked the guard, "Are there kids in here?" "Yeah." I want to meet one. How about in this cell?" And Jack is looking the cell up and down, and there's locks and bolts up and down the whole thing. And the guard is like, "Hold on, this lock is a little bit fussy." So he goes and grabs something and comes back with the Holy Bible. What? And he whacks the lock with the Holy Bible, and it comes undone. Yeah, this is how just horrible and deplorable this place is. Jack walks inside the concrete box, and he sees on top of another concrete slab, there's no mattress in here. He sees a tiny little boy, and he looks so thin. He looks like he could disappear into the walls. He looked terrified. He had no pajama bottoms, no shirt, his head was shaven, and Jack sits down next to the young boy and is like, how long have you been in here?" And he just shrugged. So the guard answers for him, and he's like, "Oh, he's been in here a while, but it's for his own protection. The other boys were sodomizing him."
What?
"Well, why is his head shaved?" "Oh, 'cause he was pulling out his hair." "Well, is he getting any help? That's not normal for a kid to do." And the guard just shrugs and is like, "We just passed the food in through the cell." So Jack is disgusted. He's horrified. Listen, there had been a lot of rumors and talks about what had been going on in here. I mean, a few years before Jack even arrived, a reporter visited the school and found that a 16-year-old boy was placed in solitary confinement. Yeah, like prison. And his name was Jim. And Jim had consumed a full glass light bulb because he was losing his mind in solitary confinement. And then he used pieces of the glass light bulb to gash his arm a dozen times. And nobody, no guard, no teacher, no staff member, nobody cared. So you're like, okay, well, how on earth is the school open in the middle of the state of freaking Florida, sunny sunshine and oranges? A reporter saw that, a teacher saw that abuse. Why wasn't the school immediately shut down and the administrators arrested? Let's talk about the Dozier School for Boys. The Dozier School for Boys was actually known as the Florida School for Boys originally. They opened in 1900, and you're like, oh, okay, so this case is from a million years ago. The school was formally shut down in 2011. It was open for over 100 years. And when it was finally shut down, there was a massive graveyard found with countless children buried in the back that nobody knew for 100+ years. I find that very hard to believe, don't you? So this is how the Florida School for Boys was marketed. If you look at this picture, I mean, yeah, it's horribly color enhanced. It looks like it's just they turned the saturation up, but it feels picturesque, doesn't it? You know, the property is not fenced. There's no electric barbed wire. It's covered by well-manicured lawns. It has pine trees, maybe some palm trees. It kind of looks like a college campus. The school apparently offered activities like football. You could join the band or the Boy Scouts. Obviously, they did not advertise the unmarked graves because, you know, if you didn't know about those kinds of things, maybe it sounded like the dream, a paradise of sorts. And the only way that you could get into that school was to be a bit of a troublemaker. Now, the definition of troublemaker is really loose. Like, what I think a troublemaker is different from what a random cop might think a troublemaker is. So who's to say? That meant a lot of the kids were just thrown into the school if adults were just tired of dealing with them for whatever reason. So, I mean, the students really vastly were different. So some could be as bad as they've committed acts of sexual violence or assaulted other people, and then another kid would have been thrown into the Dozier School for Boys just because they were caught smoking a cigarette, or maybe they skipped a few classes. So, I mean, you had a really weird mix of kids in there. Now, Ed Adams was a former student of Dozier. He got out alive, and he tried to live his best life. Ed got married, had children, and for decades, life was just never what he expected. He thought when he got out of Dozier, life would change, things would get better. He saw his neighbors, he saw friends, and they all had troubles in life, okay? They weren't perfect. But don't get me wrong, they all slept well most of the time. They didn't have the nightmares that Ed had, or the trauma, or the PTSD. But the nightmares, he said the nightmares were the worst. He would always see the one-armed man in his nightmares. And it would fuel his depression. It was like the only fuel that he was getting, because Ed went from a healthy 165 pounds to less than 100 pounds. I mean, he couldn't eat, he couldn't sleep, he couldn't keep anything down, he was abusing antidepressants, he was spiraling into his illness.
Heads up.
And his family, they're trying to help, but at night it was the worst. Because his family would fall asleep, and Ed would toss and turn. He couldn't sleep. He was scared of the dark at like 60 years old. So in an attempt to try and feel better, he starts writing a diary at night. And he pours out his pain onto page after page. And he said it was painful to exist. Like, it hurt to exist. It hurt to just sit down or lie down because he didn't have any muscles or fat tissue. He was emaciated. He didn't even have any of that to cushion his bones. But it wasn't even the physical pain that got him. It was the memories. Whenever he closed his eyes, he was back in that room, that bloody white room. And then there was that one-armed man raising his arm with the leather strap, and the belt would hit the ceiling of the low roof and come crashing down straight onto Ed's body. And he would squirm in pain. Ed wrote, "When I was dragged in that room, I knew something bad was going to happen to me. I was placed onto a small bed. It's about 3 feet wide, 5 to 6 feet long. The bed was near the floor and it had this filthy mattress on it. I was told to hold on to the end of the bed railing and not move or cry. And then I remember the sound of something cutting the air, followed by a pain that I can't even describe. The most horrible pain a human being can imagine. I mean, it hurt so terribly badly. I would try and move to get up from the bed, thinking, God, please make them stop beating me. But they beat me, and they beat me so bad." In another entry, Ed wrote, "I can't write about this anymore. God, make them stop." Another one, "God, please stop." And in 2009, Ed passed away, but he left a note for his wife and children, and it was like his last will and testament. And he had 2 dying wishes. Ed wrote, the first wish was that he wanted to translate Elvis songs from cassette to a disc, and the other wish was to tell everybody how he had been abused at the Florida School for Boys. And that's what they would do, his whole family. So a lot of victims started to come out over the time, and they were talking about their trauma, their mental, emotional, physical, sexual abuse. And this is crazy. They were like seniors when they came out about the abuse stories.
Wow.
So many victims had already passed. A lot of them were in jail. I mean, it's crazy. Okay, but they called themselves the White House Boys because it happened in the White House. So you're like, whoa.
The White House?
The White House? Okay, not that one. That one is the most secure building in the entire country. This White House that we're talking about today was the most dangerous. It was a shed, a small building. It looks more like a shed. Here, let me take a picture of it. It's essentially like 4 walls and a door and a few windows. The roof was low and completely flat. I mean, imagine just a box. The building itself was painted white, and the windows had this green molding, but most of them were boarded up so you couldn't even see inside. It was a far cry from the Oval Office. Like, this is not plush or fancy or for high-powered, protected people. It looks like that. If the outside isn't bad, the inside is going to shock you. The walls inside were white, and they were smeared with vomit, grime, and blood. There's one portion of the wall where there's a bloody print, like someone had placed their bloody fingertips and just dragged it down the wall. And when you walk in, I mean, the whole place makes your eyes water, because all you can smell is this thick stench of blood and sweat and urine and a hint of whiskey. Inside the room, there's only just a bed, and that's it. The mattress is caked in vomit and blood, and if you were brought into the White House, and this was your first time, there was no warm welcome. There was this one-armed man, is what all the students called him. The one-armed man would throw you down onto the mattress, face down, and he would tell you to hold on to the railings of the bed. You're holding onto the bed frame. Maybe if you really want, you can bite down on the pillow so you don't scream, or maybe it'll help with the pain, but the pillow is caked in blood and vomit. And the one-armed man was getting ready. He was holding a leather strap. He had to be sensitive. It was like a little toolbox. The students would lie down, and they heard it before they felt it. That's what they all said. They would hear him shuffling his feet as if you're getting ready to, I don't know, throw the bowling ball down the lane. Like you're preparing for something. It's like he needed to get into position, like he's about to do a set at the gym. And then you would hear the leather belt cut the stale air and then smack on the ceiling before falling straight onto you. And then the boys said that you would feel the pain. And the worst part was you could almost time the pain. It was always the same. The shuffling of the feet, the whip cutting the air, then smacking the ceiling, and then onto you. If you were lucky, you would get a few dozen whips. If you were unlucky, you would get over 100 whips in one time. All the students could barely walk out of the White House. They would have to pull, because they were still clothed when this happened. Their clothes would be embedded in the lacerations because the whip was so powerful. So they would have to peel the clothes off of their bloody skin. The first time was rough, but somehow the staff at Dozier made sure that each time you were dragged into the White House, it would be worse. It was a level of like sadistic cruelty that is just unheard of. Sometimes the staff would drag 2 to 3 boys in at a time, and sometimes if they were mad at you for whatever it was, they would drag you out of your bed in the dark of night, and you would be dragged by your arms through the lawns into the White House for your beating. You're like, okay, what the hell did they do? Like, obviously, nobody deserves that, but what on earth are they so mad about? Like, what did you do? It could have been the smallest freaking thing. Johnny Lee Gaddy was punished in the White House because one of the other students, a 6-year-old boy, fell into the mud, and Johnny tried to help him get up. And the staff was like, we don't like that. If the 6-year-old boy fell in the mud, the 6-year-old boy should fucking struggle to get up. Okay, before we get into all of that, let me tell you about Johnny first. Johnny was black, and this is kind of important to the story. He was 11 years old, and this is in like the 50s and 60s. I mean, if you think there's raging racism right now, which there is, think back then. Like, it was really evident that there was so much racism. I mean, just look at Dozier. Back in the day, the white kids and minorities were separated. They were segregated. And it seemed like the police and teachers were more than happy to send more black boys to Dozier. I believe it was like 2/3 black kids and 1/3 like white kids.
But what kind of school is it?
It's a reform school for bad boys.
Oh.
So, I mean, you could be sent for literally anything. That's why it's hard to say it was for bad boys. And I'm not even making this up. Johnny was sent to Dozier for a stutter. He had a stutter, and the kids bullied him relentlessly, and he was so stressed out that he skipped school. The police came to his house to see him and told him, hey, you skipped school, so we need to take you before a judge because you skipped school. The cop lied. There was no judge. Johnny was thrown in jail. He's 11, just to remind you, and he waited hours. The cop walked by the cell and was like, hey, and I quote, hey boy, get up. And he's like, where's the judge? And he said, N-word, you're going to Dozier. Yeah, there was no judge. That's how Johnny found himself at Dozier. It was bad. The minute that he got there, one of the staff members got up in his face and said, and I quote, boy, your life is gonna change. And it did. I mean, his whole life turned into a nightmare. Johnny spent every waking moment of his days in Dozier performing free hard labor. He had to work on the farm. He had to tend to crops, raise and slaughter livestock. Again, another friendly reminder that he's freaking 11 years old, but he's waking up at 6 a.m. to do hard manual labor. He wasn't even one of the youngest boys there. There were boys as young as 6 and 7 years old. Like, I don't know how on earth to even make it make sense. Like, the kids are skipping school because you're being bullied. So to teach him not to skip school because you're being bullied, you send him to a school that is more on par with a concentration camp from North Korea. Like, tell me how that makes sense.
Targets in sight.
Johnny said Dozier was a bad boy school, and I was labeled as a bad boy. But we had boys that were just 6 years old at Dozier, and I would always wonder, what could a 6-year-old do that is so bad that they would send to Dozier? And you're like, okay, how is this legal? How are the cops sending boys here? How is this even operating? The school made it seem like the boys were just helping produce food for the other students and for the staff, like a little school garden. But the school was actually selling produce for profit. And they were making quite a bit of profit. Like, I'm talking hundreds of thousands of dollars of profit.
they're doing that for some money?
Yeah. And most of the boys in the school were black, so black unpaid child labor for large profits. So just like 1865 never happened. I mean, this is 1950. Like, sure, it's a long time ago from today, but it's still not the 1800s long ago. And that's not even that long ago if you really think about it. But, like, are we not seeing how alarming and terrifying that is? And the boys weren't allowed to interact with each other. They weren't allowed to even help each other. Again, very reminiscent of, and again, and maybe that's very inflammatory to say, but very reminiscent of slavery. And that is why Johnny was punished. A teacher threw Johnny and a 6-year-old boy, let's call him Frank, they were thrown out to go cut down a tree. Which, like, again, this kid is 11 and the other kid is 6. Do I need to remind you, like, how are you going to cut down a tree? It was a big tree. So the Karen or whoever threw them out was like, here, take this two-handed saw. Do you know what, like, a two-handed saw is? There's a handle on each side. It's very long.
Yeah.
You need 2 people to, like, saw it back and forth, right?
Yeah.
Johnny said Frank could barely hold the handle. I mean, of course. He said he was so weak and little, when Johnny pushed like this, Frank would just fall down onto the ground. So Johnny is trying to help him back up because he knows that they're going to the White House if they don't cut down this damn tree and if they don't do it freaking fast. And when the staff saw him help the 6-year-old boy, they got mad. They were like, why are you helping him? And they dragged both of them into the White House to be punished. And Johnny says that he still remembers the smell. The blood stain on the walls, the one-armed man who made him bite down on a vomit-covered pillow, and he remembered the man warning him, you better hold on tight. It's for your own good. Johnny was confused. But then the first blow came, and then the pain made his ears ring, and he let go of the railing. And that was like the worst thing he could have done. Because the blows were so fast and they were so strong that his body was bouncing around the mattress. And the man did not wait for him to get his grip on the railing again. Had he flipped over, the power of the blow would have easily ruptured his testicles. It would have easily killed him. The one-armed man yelled at him for trying to be a smart N-word for letting go, and hit him on the back and his head. So when the beating was over, Johnny had lacerations all over his body and drenched in blood. And instead of letting him go to a nurse, Johnny was told to go to the cafeteria so he could send a message to all the other boys that, and I quote, "We're not playing with you boys." But that's not all. Johnny was repeatedly beat, sexually assaulted, and emotionally manipulated at Dozier. I mean, it wasn't just in the White House. There was a lot of sexual assault going on in Dozier, from the staff and from the other boys, who honestly, they're being beat, they're being traumatized. This is a breeding ground for creating violent offenders and serial killers, if I'm being honest. And the worst part is, technically, Johnny is considered one of the because at least he made it up. That's what they would tell him. So there had been some boys that tried to run away, and this is like straight out of the movie. Dozier allegedly had dogs that they would release, and the dogs would tear you apart so that you could be brought back to the school. But sometimes the kids never made it back. Now, originally Johnny thought, okay, well maybe they succeeded in running away, or maybe they didn't, or who knows, right? Or sometimes kids would go into the White House and they would never come back. Again, you're like, what does that mean? One time, a student went to the White House to be punished, and he saw another boy, severely injured and limp in the corner, and he was not moving.
Mission failed.
And one day, Johnny was taking trash out to be burned in this big garbage pit that they're just incinerating the fire, and in the trash pile, he noticed something that looked like a human hand. And he pointed it out to his friend and was like, oh my god, is that a freaking hand? And his friend looks at him and is like, shh, don't ever repeat that. Don't ever do that again, because you're going to be in the pile next. Nobody wants anyone to find out what's happening here. So, are they killing boys? Well, Dozier's school records show admittance dates for a ton of boys, but no release date. I mean, sure, you could call it bad record keeping because the school's been open for over 100 years, but I don't think so. The White House Boys, a group of survivors that came together to seek justice in 2009, by then, like I said, most of them were seniors, and it was heartbreaking. One of them, named Stu, said that before he went into the White House for a beating, he was waiting outside. He could hear all of his friends screaming inside for their lives. He bent over and picked up this small pebble that caught his eye. And he was rolling it between his fingers, and he just noticed how smooth it was and how good it felt. He kept it in his pocket for the rest of his life. And later, when he was telling this story, 50, 60 years later, he still had that pebble. It was like his own little safety net. the stories were so heart-wrenching. There was so much public attention around the survivors, and finally the state of Florida launched an inspection. And like, mind you, the school opened in 1900, and at this point in 2009 the school was still operating. The school was still open.
Are they doing the same thing though?
Yeah, they're still pretty abusive. I don't know about the White House still being open, but there was a lot of assault by the guards. Like, it was straight up prison, if not worse. So the state of Florida launched an inspection, and Dozier failed the inspection and was finally shut down in 2011. And if you're like, wait, what about the beginning of the story? What about Jack? Did he not call the police on Dozier about what he saw? What about the reporter that went? They did. They tried to draw attention, but nobody cared. Authorities inspected Dozier, found horrible things, like the fact that the boys were being forced to lie down on their stomachs, and then their wrists and ankles were shackled together. They were hogtied. Just for hours on end. Dozier at this point wasn't even trying to hide anything, but the authorities would just slap a warning on their door and move on. Even just 3 years into opening Dozier, it's not like over time the cookie got rotten, do you know what I mean? Like, it was immediate. Just 3 years into opening Dozier, they were involved in a scandal. Authorities had found boys as young as 5 years old being beaten, shackled, and starved, and hired out as free labor. So, like, if you owned a farm nearby in Florida, you could hire these random boys for free. But the school was like, I pinky promise that we're gonna do better. And the authorities were like, okay, fine, you silly goose, we trust you. And the school remained open. But this time, all they changed was that they made the boys write home about how much they loved it at school, how much fun they were having, how much they loved Boy Scouts and football, like the school promise that they had. And then not too long after that, there was a fire at the school. 6 boys and 2 staff members died because they were trapped in the dorm. Now, authorities were like, wait, what do you mean they were trapped in the dorm? Yeah, well, we lock it so they can't escape. So they burnt to death because you locked the doors because you're treating them like prisoners. Yeah, precisely. Instead of shutting down the school, they were just like, we're gonna fire the superintendent and you guys need a new superintendent. And that is how Arthur Dozier took over the school. He was a really humble dude. So humble, in fact, that he renamed the school from Florida School for Boys to Dozier School for Boys. And that year, the first year on the job, the governor of Florida visited and found the place in shambles. Like, they had no shame. They were like, Governor, come on over. Let me show you the details. Let me show you this kid that's been hogtied. This one's been in solitary confinement. I mean, he's ripping out his hair, but it's fine, right? You get it, Governor. I mean, the walls were broken, there were leaking ceilings, buckets were being used as toilets, bunk beds were crammed into the room to accommodate overcrowding, like there was no heat in the winter. The governor said it was like walking into a training ground for a life of crime, like they're breeding criminals in here. Honestly, some prisons might have been safer and more sanitary, yet the school kept running. Like, the governor visited and was like, this is gonna create criminals, but the school kept running. The authorities were like, just, can you not take too many people in? And eventually, Dozier School for Boys did get security cameras later on, right? But legend has it, the workers would smear Vaseline onto the cameras to make it super blurry. So you can't see much, but a video did get out in 2007 of a young 18-year-old boy named Justin Caldwell who was being assaulted by the guards. The guards just grabbed him by the throat and slammed him down onto the ground and dragged Justin to the center of the room, and you can see that he's bleeding from his head and his legs are twitching. So yeah, 2007. I mean, like, you can just imagine the sheer number of victims at Dozier in the past 100 plus years. The survivors are suffering from depression, PTSD. A lot of them turn to alcohol, drugs, crime. Some of them can barely sleep through the night. They have nightmares. Others can't seem to stay in a relationship or even, like, be around their family members. A lot of them went on to be hardened criminals to rob and kill, and I'm not absolving them of their crimes because, not that I have that authority to begin with, but don't you feel like the boys would have been better just, I don't know, being light troublemakers? I mean, this, like, really cemented a horrible future for the boys. One survivor said, and I quote, "I survived Vietnam and I survived Dozier, and Dozier being the hardest of the two." And in 2012, after 1 year of being shut down, the state authorized a forensic anthropology survey by the University of South Florida. Because there had been so many rumors and more talks, one survivor remembered that he and another boy were forced to dig 3 holes in the ground outside the cafeteria in the dead of night. And they later went on to say, all the staff told us was the hole should be 4 feet deep, and when we asked how long should the hole be, they told them to fit a boy. Well, the anthropologists went out there. They documented nearly 100 deaths, and they found 50 unmarked graves. Yeah, behind the school. 3 times as many black students as white students were buried at Dozier, and in 2017, the state held a formal ceremony to apologize personally to 24 survivors and to families of other victims. And in 2019, during a preliminary survey work for a pollution cleanup, because, also, side note, a lot of buried bodies causes concern for sanitation safety for humans. It's like a biohazard, right? Especially unmarked graves when they're not in coffins. It's a lot, and it's just like a whole thing, okay? So they went out there for like a pollution cleanup, and they found another 27 suspected graves, hinting that there would be a lot more bodies than previously suspected buried around Dozier. There's actually a book written by the leading anthropologist that worked on the Dozier site. It's called Carry Their Bones. And she remembered asking a courthouse archivist for records of the boys at the school, right? And the archivist sharply corrected her and said, "You mean the inmates?" This is like 100 years later. I mean, the school has been closed down. Like, what does she have against these boys? She doesn't even know these boys. And when she couldn't come up with all the records, the anthropologist is like, "That's it?" The archivist is like, "Yeah, well, there's not a lot of records on the inmates because," and I quote, "they was just throwaways." And that is the story of the Dozier School for Boys. This has been highly requested, and it's like the most mind-boggling thing that, I don't know why going into it I was like, oh, it's probably a school that closed down in like, I don't know, 1920. The fact that it was still open in 2010 is insane. And the fact that it was open for that long, can you just imagine the sheer number of victims? I don't think we'll ever really get an accurate victim count. It's probably in tens of thousands.
I heard like there's some similar ones in China too. I heard there's even ones going on like nowadays. Maybe you can talk about it. It's so traumatizing. Like some of these quote schools will do to kids.
I think it reminds me of like mental institutions, like psychiatric institutions, because I think the whole mindset is, oh, well, these boys are bad boys, so we can't trust anything they say. They just want to get out. They're being sneaky. They're being manipulative. They just want to be free so that they can, I don't know, get involved in petty theft and hang out with their other bad influence friends. It's like the psychiatric institutions. They're like, oh, no, don't trust what they're saying because they're a little bit cuckoo. So nobody really gives it much thought. And that is insane to me. Like, what are your thoughts? Genuinely, I think that this is worse than prison. Let me know your thoughts in the comments.
Ramble.
Bada bing, bada boom.
In a prison cell in South Korea, there's these 2 very pretty, very young girls sitting at the edge of their prison beds. They're in the same cell, and they're either going to be very friendly or they're going to rip each other apart by the end of this. There's going to be no middle ground here. So they start feeling each other out. And how old are you? I'm 95. You? Side note, in Korea, usually when someone asks you for your age, you give them the year of your birth first. It's interesting, but 95 meaning 1995. So by this point, she would have been, what,